This is the story of my life falling apart, my journey in putting it back together, and my attempt to use my story to change the way we approach the topic. There's no nice way to put this, but about 2 years ago, I was raped. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I found myself walking the streets of Kingston in a part of the city I had never seen before. I was lost, I couldn't reach my friends, and no cabs were answering. I was alone, and I felt numb. After walking for over an hour, my phone rang, and it was a friend. They asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. This paralyzing mental numbness that would come to control my life for the next 2 years wouldn't let me. So I instead replied with a vague indication that my night hadn't gone as planned. With that said, my friend likely thought I was drunk and suggested I get to bed. Eventually, I arrived home just as the sun was coming up. I went to my bedroom and decided to get some sleep in the hopes that going to sleep would erase the night from my head. But when I closed my eyes, I realized these horrifying memories were not going away. This very bed became my safe space or my hideaway. It was removed from a reality that I still couldn't face. The bed remained my home as I tried to forget what had happened and as I experienced a new pain, a pain unlike any physical or mental pain I had experienced before. I cut myself off from the outside world. I stopped seeing friends and communicating with my loved ones. I became deeply apathetic towards everything in my life: school, friends, family. Nothing mattered to me anymore. I stopped caring for myself in many ways. By the end of my second year, I had dropped about 50 pounds. I either found myself without an appetite or actually lacking any motivation to eat. But most of all, I had convinced myself that I didn't deserve food. How could I if I just lied in bed all day? Despite the fact my life was falling apart, the people around me didn't notice much of a difference. To an observer, my behavior actually wasn't that unusual. I think we all here know someone who might drink multiple times a week, or maybe they sleep too much, or maybe you know someone who's become apathetic and uncommitted. We often see these things as normal because they're such common coping behaviors of university students. My struggles were compounded by what felt like this constant and deep pressure looming over my head. This pressure was the result of an image I had of myself as a guy's guy, and the people around me had come to know me by this identity too. My years leading sports teams, competing in weightlifting, and working on an oil rig became these unique barriers to getting the help that, at this point, I desperately needed. We tend to think of men as both physically and emotionally strong. Physically strong enough to deter or resist an unwanted sexual advance, and emotionally strong enough to maintain composure even in the most damaging and hurtful of circumstances. If I wasn't strong enough to do either of these things, I questioned if I was the man I always thought I was. Instead of seeking help and support from my loved ones, I turned my back on them. I became angry, aggressive, and unreachable. Eventually, this new extreme behavior of mine no longer went unnoticed, and these very people began to push away. As the months passed, this numbness, anger, and deep depression that had come to take over my life slowly began to give way. I started to feel like myself again and began returning to the social circles I had previously abandoned. Although I was slowly but surely recovering, I still denied the event in my head and had actually, in this weird way, convinced myself the rape had never even happened. One night, about a year after the incident, I went out with friends drinking more than I should have. I drank that night as a means of dissociating myself from the reality that I couldn't face. But on this night, I chose to do something I had long wanted to do, and I made my first call for help. I reached out to what was now my former partner of 4 years and told them, as the first person, that I had been raped. A short time later, I made my next call for help when I reached out to a counselor. This time, I attended the session after previously canceling, but I was unable to tell them exactly what had happened, so I left feeling unsatisfied, helpless, and just as desperate as before. My next attempt to call for help was when I considered pursuing legal action against the people who had raped me. I thought to myself, this could provide me with some closure or allow me to feel I'd finally done something to lift myself from the mess that was now my life. However, my mind quickly became clouded with the image of these people staring across from me in the courtroom, their word against mine. What if the judges and others thought I was lying? Why would I only bring something to court months after it had happened? I thought my image as a hyper-masculine male would surely fall apart as the people that knew me found out what had happened to me. And I questioned if I would be blamed for my own rape. Lastly, I considered the statistics. In Canada, roughly 1 out of 10 people that experience sexual assault will go on and report it to the police. Yet, out of every 10 that do report it to the police, only 2 will lead to a conviction. I thought if a young woman is so often unable to convict their male abuser, that I would surely have no chance. It was pointless, the risks too high and the benefits just too low. Today, I stand in front of you as a survivor that is still trying to put together the pieces almost 2 months later. I've made strides in some areas, but I continue to face challenges in many others. After missteps with counseling and deciding not to pursue legal action against the people who had hurt me, I decided to try a new avenue, and I decided to try to share my experiences as an attempt to heal. The first step in this process was writing an article for a university paper on my campus. I thought it would allow me to share my story, hopefully support other survivors, and use it as an opportunity to advocate for better resources for people like me on my campus. The article received an overwhelmingly positive response. It showed to me there was a community that wanted to support me that I didn't know existed before, and that people's perceptions of me would not be changed as a male survivor. I also learned that my story resonated with other survivors and that people who hadn't experienced sexual assault were better able to understand and empathize with people like me. While many survivors or people who experience traumatic events may not find publicly sharing or discussing their experiences as the best way to heal, for me, this was a key step in my healing. In fact, recently my life has brightened. I found medication which works for me. I found friends who make me feel loved and supported. And I have begun to actually enjoy spending time with all my loved ones and friends once again. And perhaps most importantly, I'm excited about what the future holds, and and I feel confident I can and will make the most out of it. Sitting here today, you might rightfully expect me to view the people who raped me as sick, twisted individuals, undeserving of forgiveness. And for a long time, I viewed them exactly that way. But today, my view has come to evolve and change as I came to realize holding on to these deep negative feelings towards them was not allowing me to grow and heal. For this reason, I've had to come to a certain level of forgiveness so that I could carry on and heal. This is why I'm on stage today, as a victim, to try to provide insight into how we can move forward, both as individuals who have experienced sexual assault and as the greater society that should be supporting them. You may wonder why exactly I decided to share with you my story of sexual assault. I refused help because I believed men had to be independent. I told no one about my rape because I knew my emotions would come out, and I didn't believe real men showed their emotions. I couldn't face the outside society or world anymore because I was no longer the person I thought I was. I allowed my body to decay because I could not admit, even to myself, that this strong body I'd built up had not even been strong enough to protect myself. My relationship crumbled as I was unable to tell my girlfriend that I had been raped because I believed it would change her perception of me as a man. What I've come to understand is that there is no one identity of a man, and there's no necessity for one person's type of masculinity to be the same as another's. From a young age, men are taught to man up in times of crisis or pain, to use physicality to show dominance, to never be emasculated, and to not show their emotions. A study from the University of California, Berkeley, discovered that when men had their masculinity questioned or challenged, they were more likely to immediately become more aggressive and hold homophobic beliefs and attitudes. This study indicated an overarching issue with the male psyche today. Many men struggle with what their identity is and thus rely on these outdated ideas of masculinity, whether that be having to be stronger than their friends, being able to drink more, being able to sleep with more women, or being able to not cry. The notion that we should reject more fluid gender roles because they conflict with masculinity is fundamentally misguided. As I've sought to learn more about what makes me a man, I've learned how gender equity and a liberation from traditional gender roles can release men from the constraints of masculinity. Challenging one's own identity or one's own masculinity means stripping it down and from there rebuilding it in a healthy, productive way. You can be a man who cries. You can be a man who has never played a sport in your life. You can even be a man who has been raped. When I challenged this identity and the norms that I had been taught, it was only then that I began to heal. Recently, I've been able to begin reconstructing my own identity, this time not basing it on these traditional masculine traits, but rather on ones that I believe make my own identity as a man. These now include confidence, passion, honesty, loyalty, kindness, and perseverance. Let's work harder to understand how societal norms, like conventional notions of masculinity, can prevent survivors from seeking help. Once we've understood these issues, let's work together to challenge them as the dominant ways of thinking so that we can realize a society that doesn't impose pressures on its most vulnerable, but instead builds them up. Today, I ask you to join me in reshaping the way we approach sexual violence against any and all genders, and to challenge your own notions of masculinity. To do this, we must consider how we interact with the men in our lives. Through making these small changes in the way we interact with the men in our lives, we can begin to shape a new society, one in which no one is left putting together their own pieces. To do this, we must resist using phrases like man up and be a man when the men in our lives show vulnerability, and instead tell our sons, brothers, and boyfriends that showing their emotions is healthy, that sensitivity is strength, and vulnerability is power. Thank you.